The city didn't care about quiet things. It preferred the roar of the subway grates, the hiss of hydraulic bus brakes, and the endless, flat drone of thousands of people rushing toward places they didn't particularly want to be. On a Tuesday afternoon in early October, the corner of 4th and Elm was a blur of gray coats and wet umbrellas. Sitting on a damp green bench near the edge of the public square, Brody felt like he was watching a film with the sound turned off. He was 34 years old, but his knees felt 50, and his mind felt older than the concrete beneath his boots. His military backpack, faded to a dull olive drab and patched with heavy black thread near the zipper, sat between his feet like an anchor. Beside him sat Baron. The German Shepherd didn't look like the kind of dog people stopped to pet. He was large, even for a male of his breed, with a dark, almost entirely black coat, except for the deep tan markings around his chest and legs. His left ear carried a small notch from a piece of jagged metal in a valley 3,000 miles away, and his muzzle was already starting to turn gray, giving him the look of an old professor who had spent too much time in dusty archives. Baron didn't pace, and he didn't pant. He simply sat, his weight pressed firmly against Brody's left shin, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with a slow, methodical rhythm. He was checking exits. He was measuring distances. He was doing exactly what Brody's brain was doing, even though both of them were supposedly retired from the business of staying alive. "Too loud, isn't it, buddy?" Brody murmured, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Baron's tail gave a single, solid thump against the wooden slats of the bench. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. The silent pressure of his shoulder against Brody's leg was the only conversation they required. Brody had been out of the Navy for 11 months. They called the transition reintegration, a clean corporate word that made it sound like plugging a hard drive back into a computer. But Brody felt less like a hard drive and more like a gear with half its teeth stripped. In the Navy, every morning had a purpose, every movement was part of a sequence, and every man beside him had a name and a job. Here, people drifted past like smoke. He had spent the last 3 days walking the city, not because he had a destination, but because staying in his small, rented studio apartment made the walls feel like they were slowly leaning inward. The wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of exhaust, damp asphalt, and then, suddenly, something else. It was the warm, yeasty scent of toasted flour and caramelized sugar. It was a smell that didn't belong to the cold, metallic landscape of the city square. It was old-fashioned. It smelled like a kitchen where someone had left the oven door open on a snowy morning. Baron's nose twitched. His head turned slowly toward the corner of the square, where a small wooden cart stood beneath a faded blue umbrella. The cart was small, built of dark pine that had seen too many winters. A small hand-painted sign hung from the crossbar, the letters slightly crooked. Maria's Bread and Sweet Rolls. Behind the cart stood an older woman. She wore a thick knitted gray cardigan that was missing the bottom 2 buttons and a dark apron tied twice around her waist. Her hands, rough and swollen at the knuckles, were moving with a strange, rhythmic grace. She wasn't looking at the bread she was arranging. Her eyes, clouded and still, stared straight ahead into the gray fog of the square. She was blind. Brody watched her. She didn't have a bell or a megaphone. She simply stood behind her small wooden counter, her fingers gently touching the edges of the small paper bags, ensuring each loaf of bread was aligned. When a commuter rushed past, nearly knocking over her small display of cinnamon rolls, she didn't flinch. She simply reached out, her hand moving like a radar dish until she touched the wood, and gently pushed the tray back into place. "Nobody's buying today, Baron," Brody said softly. The lunch rush had ended an hour ago, and the cart's shelves were still mostly full. The bread looked beautiful, golden brown crusts dusted with white flour, round rustic loaves that looked heavy and solid. But the people walking past were looking at their phones, their thumbs flicking through screens as they navigated the sidewalk. To them, the old woman and her wooden cart were just another obstacle to avoid, like a fire hydrant or a trash can. Brody reached into his pocket. He had exactly $7.40 left of his cash for the day. He had been planning to buy a cheap box of dry dog food for Baron and a can of soup for himself at the bodega down the street. But the smell of the bread was making his stomach ache in a way he couldn't ignore. He stood up, his knee joints popping with a dry, metallic sound. Baron stood instantly, his shoulders squaring, his nose aligning with Brody's hip. They walked toward the cart. The squeak of Brody's worn leather boots on the wet pavement was quiet, but as they drew within 10 feet, the old woman's head tilted. Her chin rose slightly, her ears tracking the sound of their approach. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was surprisingly deep, with a soft, melodic accent that sounded like the hills of southern Europe. "The air is cold today. The bread is still warm from the stone." Brody stopped. He looked at the loaves, then at his handful of crumpled bills. "How much for a small round loaf?" Maria didn't reach for her measuring scale or her bags. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her blind eyes turning toward Brody's voice. She didn't look at his face. Her ears were listening to the cadence of his breath, the stiffness in his posture, and the heavy, flat tone of a man who hadn't spoken to anyone else all day. "For you," she said, her voice dropping to a gentle murmur. "It is a difficult day, yes?" Brody stiffened. It was the old military reflex. Never show a weakness. Never admit to the struggle. "Just looking for some bread, man." "I hear the weight in your boots," she said, her hand reaching out to touch the wooden edge of her counter. "And I hear the breathing of a very large friend beside you. He is very quiet, this one. Very polite." Baron let out a soft huff of air through his nose, his tail shifting once. "This is Baron," Brody said. "Baron," Maria repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "A noble name for a noble soldier. My name is Maria." She reached down into the lower shelf of her cart, her fingers selecting a small round loaf of rustic sourdough. It was the last one of its kind on the tray, the crust dark and cracked like dry earth. She wrapped it quickly in a sheet of brown paper, her movements so practiced they looked like magic. "Here," she said, holding the package out across the counter. "Take it." Brody held out his $7. "How much?" Maria shook her head, her gray hair slipping from beneath her knitted cap. "No, the bread is not for sale to you today. It is a gift." "I can't take this for free, ma'am," Brody said, his pride tightening his throat. "You're running a business. I pay my way." "A business?" Maria laughed softly, a sound like dry autumn leaves scraping across a driveway. "A business is for making money, yes. But bread is for keeping the heart warm. Today, your heart is cold. I can hear it in your voice. It is like the wind off the river. Take the bread, eat it with your friend." Brody stood frozen. In his world, nothing was free. Everything had a cost, usually paid in sweat, blood, or time. To have a stranger, an old woman who clearly had very little herself, offer him her labor without asking for anything in return felt foreign. It felt dangerous, like a trap he didn't know how to disarm. But before Brody could speak, before he could find the words to refuse her kindness or force her to take his money, Baron moved. The German Shepherd didn't growl, and he didn't bark. He stepped forward, his massive head reaching over the low wooden bar of the cart. Brody went to grab his collar, his heart jumping. But Baron's movements were incredibly slow, almost ritualistic. The dog reached his muzzle toward the paper-wrapped loaf. His teeth, large and white, clamped onto the very edge of the brown paper with the delicate precision of a surgeon. He didn't tear it. He didn't shake it. He simply took the weight of the loaf from Maria's hand. "Baron, drop it," Brody hissed, his hand reaching for the dog's muzzle. But Maria smiled, her face lighting up with a sudden, brilliant warmth. "No, let him. He has better manners than the men who run the banks. He knows when a gift is offered." Baron stood there for a second, holding the bread in his mouth. Then he lowered his head. With a soft clink, he dropped something onto the wooden counter right in front of Maria's hand. Brody looked down, his mouth slightly open. It was a ball. It wasn't just any ball. It was a heavy, solid blue rubber canine toy, scarred with deep tooth marks and faded from years of being carried through mud, sand, and seawater. It was Baron's prized possession. It was the ball he had carried in his mouth during helicopter transports in the Helmand province. It was the ball he slept with every night in Brody's cramped apartment. Baron didn't let anyone touch that ball. If Brody tried to take it, Baron would play a game of gentle but stubborn tug-of-war for hours. Yet there it was, sitting on the wooden counter, slightly damp from the dog's saliva, resting right against Maria's fingers. Maria's hand searched the wood until her fingertips brushed the rubber. She picked it up, her rough skin feeling the deep grooves of the bite marks, the heavy, solid weight of the toy. Her eyes widened, and then she let out a long, soft breath. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh my." "Baron, what are you doing?" Brody muttered, genuinely bewildered. The German Shepherd didn't answer. He simply sat back down, the paper-wrapped loaf held securely in his jaws, his eyes fixed on Maria's face. His tail gave two slow, deliberate thumps against the concrete. "He is trading," Maria said, her fingers tracing the circular shape of the ball. "He knows the law of the road. You do not take without giving. He has given me his finest treasure." A businessman in a tailored gray suit, who had been rushing toward the office building across the street, with his eyes glued to his tablet, had paused when Baron stepped up to the cart. Now he was standing 5 feet away, his tablet lowered, a look of quiet disbelief on his face. Did that dog just buy bread with a ball?" the man asked, his voice cutting through the traffic noise. Another woman, carrying a grocery bag, stopped beside him. "I think he did. Look at him. He's waiting for his change." A small circle of onlookers began to form, their hurried paces slowing as they watched the massive war dog sitting politely with a loaf of sourdough in his mouth, while the blind woman held a dirty blue rubber ball like it was made of solid gold. Brody felt the back of his neck grow warm. He wasn't used to crowds unless he was clearing them out. "We should go, Baron," he muttered. "No, wait," Maria said. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, round butter biscuit, one of the sweet treats she kept in a tin near the back. She held it out. "For the change, the transaction must be complete." Baron looked at the biscuit, then at Brody. He didn't move until Brody gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The dog gently set the paper-wrapped sourdough down on the bench behind him, stepped back to the cart, took the biscuit from Maria's fingers with his front teeth, and swallowed it in one dry gulp. Then he took his loaf of bread back into his mouth and stood ready. The crowd laughed, a warm, sudden sound that seemed to push back the cold October wind. The businessman smiled, reaching into his pocket. "Well, if the dog is buying, I guess I have no excuse. Give me 2 of those cinnamon rolls, please." "And a loaf of the rye for me," the woman with the grocery bag added, stepping up to the counter. Within 5 minutes, a small queue had formed behind Brody. Maria's hands moved with furious efficiency, her face glowing with a flush of color as she served customer after customer. Brody stayed near the side of the cart, guiding the customers gently so they didn't crowd her, ensuring she could hear where each voice was coming from. As the crowd finally thinned out, Brody looked at the wooden cart more closely. Up close, the business didn't look like a business at all. It looked like a survival strategy. The left wheel of the cart was slightly crooked, held together with a thick binding of gray duct tape that was peeling from the dampness. The wooden frame was warped, with green mold growing in the deep cracks near the bottom joints where rainwater had pooled for years. The metal brackets holding the blue umbrella were rusted thin, vibrating with every gust of wind like they were about to snap. But it was the small ledger sitting on the shelf beneath the counter that caught Brody's eye. The ledger was open. It was written in a messy, hurried hand, not Maria's, but likely someone who helped her. Brody's eyes, trained to spot details in low light, scanned the page. Rent, $450, past due. Flour/sugar, $120. Permit renewal, $200, due October 15th. Underneath the numbers was a small note, written in red ink. Final notice. Brody's chest tightened. He knew that look. It was the same look the administrative paperwork had when a unit was about to be decommissioned. It was the language of end of the line. He looked at Maria. She was wiping the wooden counter with a damp rag, her blind eyes fixed on the empty space in front of her. She was smiling, but her shoulders were hunched, her body carrying the heavy, invisible pack of someone who knew the ground was slowly slipping away from beneath her feet. "You have a good day today, Maria," Brody said. "The best day in many weeks, soldier," she said, her fingers still holding Baron's blue ball in her apron pocket. "The dog brought the luck. Tell him he can keep the bread. But I keep the ball for now. It is good luck." "He'll expect it back," Brody said, a tiny smile breaking through his tired face. "He doesn't let anyone keep his gear for long." "We will see," she said, her eyes turning toward the sound of his voice. "We will see who has the stronger will, the Navy or the bread maker." Brody walked back to the bench. He sat down, tore the sourdough loaf in half, and gave the larger piece to Baron. The dog ate it with a slow, appreciative crunch, his tail thumping against the wet leaves on the ground. As Brody chewed the bread, he realized something. The crust was thick and dark, but the inside was incredibly soft, still holding the heat of the oven. It was the best thing he had tasted in 11 months. It tasted like someone had spent hours thinking about how to make it perfect. He looked back at the cart, then down at Baron. "She's going to lose the cart, Baron," Brody said. The dog stopped chewing, his ears shifting forward. He looked at Brody with that intense, amber-eyed stare that meant he was fully logged in. "The permit is due in 9 days, Brody muttered, his hand reaching for the small notebook he kept in his pocket. "The wheel is held together with tape. If that wheel goes, she can't push it from her kitchen. And she's blind. She can't fix a ball-bearing axle." He stood up. The numbness in his head was gone. The fog of the city had cleared, replaced by that cold, sharp focus that used to come over him when the helicopter doors opened into the dark. A mission. It wasn't a military operation. There were no targets, no extraction coordinates, and no air support. But it had an objective. Keep Maria's cart on the corner of 4th and Elm. "Let's go, partner," Brody said. "We have some phone calls to make." The next morning, Brody didn't sit on the bench. He arrived at the square at 6 a.m., before the sun had fully cleared the high-rises. The air was freezing, their breath rising in thick white plumes. Baron walked beside him, his nose low to the ground, his ears alert to the early morning delivery trucks rumbling through the streets. Brody went to the corner bodega. The owner, a broad-shouldered man named Leo, with a thick mustache and an apron that smelled of cold cuts, was sweeping the sidewalk. "Hey," Brody said, stopping near the door. Leo looked up, his broom pausing. He looked at Brody's jacket, then at the massive German Shepherd. He had seen them around the neighborhood for months. "You're the guy with the dog from the bench." "Yeah," Brody said. "I need some wood, hardwood, oak or maple, and a pair of 10-inch pneumatic wheels with ball-bearing hubs." Leo stared at him. "Do I look like a hardware store?" No, Brody said. But you know everyone who runs the deliveries in this ward. Maria's cart has a broken axle. If she doesn't get it fixed, she's off the corner by next week. The city will take her permit if she can't move the cart daily. Leo's expression changed. The hard, defensive look of a city shopkeeper softened, replaced by something older. He set the broom against the brick wall. Maria? The blind lady? Yeah. Her bread is good, Leo said, his voice dropping. My mother used to buy her sweet rolls when we first came here. But she is old now. The cart is too heavy for her. It's heavy because the wheels are shot, Brody said. If we rebuild the frame with lightweight pine and put proper utility wheels on it, she can push it with one hand. I have the tools. I just need the materials. Leo looked down at Baron. The German shepherd stepped forward, his head tilting as he looked at the bodega owner. The dog bought a loaf with a toy yesterday, Leo said, a tiny grin appearing under his mustache. The guys in the bakery across the street were talking about it. He did, Brody said, and he's currently outsourcing the labor. You in? Leo let out a long sigh, shaking his head. My cousin has a cabinet shop on 8th. He has scrap oak from a kitchen job we did last week. Let me call him. But you do the work. I don't touch wood. I touch salami. Deal, Brody said. By noon, the small alleyway behind Leo's bodega had turned into a tactical workshop. Brody had cleared his small apartment of his military toolkit, sockets, wrenches, heavy-duty grease, and a portable circular saw he had bought at a pawn shop during his first week in the city. Baron sat near the entrance of the alley, his back to the wall, acting as a sentry. He didn't mind the noise of the saw. He had slept through mortar fire, so the scream of a carbide blade through oak was nothing more than background music. Brody worked with a silent, rhythmic speed. He stripped his jacket off, his gray t-shirt showing the scars across his right shoulder as he measured, cut, and sanded. He wasn't just fixing the cart, he was reinforcing it. He rebuilt the main axle frame out of solid red oak, using steel sleeve anchors to secure the new pneumatic wheels. He replaced the rusted umbrella brackets with marine-grade stainless steel hardware he had salvaged from an old boatyard. He sanded the pine siding until the gray weather rot was gone, revealing the clean, warm grain of the wood beneath. As he worked, people from the neighborhood stopped by. First was Sarah, a young woman who worked at the print shop down the block. She brought a stencil she had made during her lunch break. If we're rebuilding it, it needs a real sign, she said. What's it say? Brody asked, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. Maria's Miracle Bread, she said, holding up the cardboard sheet. Just Maria's bread, Brody said gently. She likes things simple. By 4 p.m., the cart was finished. It looked like the same cart, but it felt entirely different. It was solid. When Brody pushed it, the new wheels rolled silently across the uneven brick of the alley without a single squeak. He had installed a small, hidden compartment beneath the cash drawer, insulated with thick foam so she could keep her butter fresh even in the summer. But they still had the problem of the permit. $200 was more than Brody had in his bank account. He sat on a crate in the alley, his hands covered in sawdust and grease, his head lowered. Baron walked over and rested his chin on Brody's knee. "We're short, buddy," Brody whispered. "We got the cart rolling, but if she can't pay the city, they'll tow it anyway." "Hey," a voice said. Brody looked up. Leo was standing in the doorway of the alley, holding a white paper bag. He reached inside and pulled out a stack of small, crumpled bills, 1s, 5s, and a few 10s. "What's that?" Brody asked. "The coffee cup on my counter," Leo said, shrugging. "I put a sign on it today, for Maria's Wheels. The guys from the transit authority, the mail carriers, the girls from the salon, they all use her bread for toast. We got $242. Brody stared at the money. In his 11 months in this city, he had thought everyone was looking out for themselves. He had thought the concrete had made them cold, but looking at the grease-stained bills, he realized they weren't cold. They were just waiting for someone to point them in the right direction. "Let's go pay the city," Brody said, standing up. On Friday morning, Maria walked slowly down 4th Street. Her hands were tucked into her cardigan sleeves, and her head was tilted down, her boots finding the familiar cracks in the pavement. Behind her, her nephew, a quiet teenager named Marco, was struggling to drag the old wooden cart. The squeak of the duct-taped wheel was louder than usual, a dry, screaming sound that made Maria's shoulders tense with every step. "Almost there, Auntie," Marco muttered, his breath short. "But the wheel, I think it's going to break today. The tape is coming off." "We go slow," Maria said, her voice steady but soft. "If it breaks, we carry the trays by hand. The people, they will be waiting for the rolls." They turned the corner into the square. The squeak of the wheel stopped. Marco stopped too, his hand releasing the wooden handle. "Marco?" Maria asked, her brow furrowing. "Why do we stop? We are not at the corner yet." "Auntie," Marco whispered, his voice shaking slightly. The cart. What about the cart? Is it broken?" "No," Marco said. It's different." Maria reached out, her hand finding the air where her cart usually sat. Instead of the rough, splintered wood of her old counter, her fingers brushed against something incredibly smooth. It smelled of fresh linseed oil and beeswax. She moved her hand lower. The frame was solid, completely rigid. There was no wobble, no damp rot. She touched the side, her fingers tracing the deep, clean grooves of the new oak trim. "Who?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Good morning, Maria," Brody said. He was standing beside the bench, his hands in his pockets. Baron was sitting at his side, his tail thumping once against the dry grass. Maria's hand flew to her mouth. She stepped closer to the cart, her fingers running over the new stainless steel brackets, the sturdy blue umbrella that didn't rattle in the wind, and then down to the wheels. She felt the thick rubber tires, the solid steel axle, the complete lack of play in the bearings. "The wheels," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears that she didn't try to hide. They have breath in them." "Pneumatic tires," Brody said, stepping closer. 10-inch. You can push it through 3 inches of snow without feeling it. And the axle is solid steel. It won't break again. "And the permit," Marco added, holding up a small pink slip of paper with the city's official seal. "It's paid, Auntie, for the whole year." Maria didn't look at the paper. She couldn't. Instead, she turned her face toward Brody. She reached out, her hands searching the air until they touched his forearms. Her fingers were shaking, her grip surprisingly strong for an old woman. "You," she said, her voice cracking. "The soldier from the bench." "My name is Brody," he said gently. "Brody," she wept, her forehead resting against his arm for a brief second. You have given me my life back. Without the cart, I am just an old woman sitting in a dark room. With the cart, I can see the world. I can hear the children. I can feed my family." "I didn't do it alone," Brody said, looking back toward the bodega where Leo was watching from the doorway. "The neighborhood wanted you here. We just supplied the tools." Baron stepped forward, his cold nose nudging Maria's apron pocket. Maria let out a wet, beautiful laugh. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the blue rubber ball. She held it out to the dog. "Here," she said. "The trade is finished. You have paid for the bread for many years, noble Baron." But Baron didn't take the ball. He looked at it, then reached his head forward, and gently pushed her hand back toward her pocket. He let out a soft, low whine, his tail wagging in a slow, wide arc. "He wants you to keep it," Brody said, his throat suddenly tight. "He says it's a permanent deposit." "A deposit?" Maria smiled, her fingers closing around the worn rubber. "Then he must come back every day to check on his investment." "He will," Brody said. "He doesn't trust civilians with his gear." That winter was the coldest the city had seen in a decade. The snow fell in thick, heavy sheets that turned the high-rises into white monoliths and buried the streets under 2 feet of ice. Most of the street vendors disappeared, their carts locked away in garages or covered in blue plastic tarps. But on the corner of 4th and Elm, the blue umbrella was always open. The cart, protected by its new marine-grade sealant, stood solid against the wind. Every morning at 7 a.m., the smell of warm sourdough and sweet cinnamon rolls would drift through the freezing air, drawing a steady line of commuters who stood with their collars turned up, waiting for their morning heat. Beside the cart, sitting on a thick, insulated rubber mat that Brody had cut from an old military truck bed, sat Barron. He wore a small, dark red canine coat that Sarah had made for him, with a small patch on the side that read, "Barron, Chief Security Officer." He sat with his head high, his ears tracking the sound of the snowplows, his eyes never leaving the crowd. He was no longer checking exits. He was just watching his neighborhood. Every tourist who walked past, attracted by the massive, handsome dog sitting beside the bakery cart, would try to play with him. They would whistle, they would hold out plastic sticks, and some would even offer him expensive treats from the fancy shops uptown. But Barron ignored them all. He sat with his jaws firmly closed, his expression as stoic as a guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier. If someone got too close to his mat, he would simply give them a look, a cool, steady gaze that made them take a step back and purchase a cinnamon roll out of sheer respect. The only time his posture changed was when Maria reached down into her tin. "Barron," she would call out, her voice clear and sweet over the winter wind. "The bakery is open." The German Shepherd would stand up, his stiff joints moving with a new, easy rhythm. He would walk over to the counter, his tail thumping against the wooden side panel that Brody had built. Maria would hold out a fresh, warm, dog-friendly oat biscuit, baked by her own hands in her kitchen the night before. Barron would take it with the delicate precision of a surgeon, swallow it in one bite, and then step back to his mat, his eyes scanning the square. Brody sat on the green bench nearby, his backpack beside him. He wasn't looking at his boots anymore. He had a job now. He was the supervisor of logistics for Maria's bread. Every afternoon, he would help Marco load the cart, check the tire pressure, and ensure the steel axles were greased against the salt on the roads. He had a mission, he had a partner, and he had a place where his boots didn't feel so heavy. One morning, a young man, a veteran, recognizable by the high and tight haircut and the stiff, guarded way he carried his shoulders, paused near the bench. He looked at the snow, the crowd, and then at Brody. "Cold day," the young man said, his voice flat. Brody looked up, his hand resting on Barron's shoulder as the dog leaned against his leg. "Yeah," Brody said, pointing toward the wooden cart where the warm steam of the sourdough was rising into the gray sky. "But the bread is warm. Go get a piece. It helps with the wind." The young man hesitated, then walked toward the cart. Barron watched him go, his tail giving a single, solid thump against the snow. The transaction was complete. The square was safe. And the river wind didn't feel so cold after all.